So I wondered, what is the cheapest possible Klipper build you could upgrade an Ender 3 with? I thought about using an old computer, but if you have a long USB cable strewn across the office, that's a tripping hazard. And if you use an old laptop, you're moving a lot of things around. So that didn't sound appealing to me. I went to single board computing, but with the rising costs of memory, I thought, how cheap is it actually to build a Klipper system using something like a Raspberry Pi? So I decided to create a little challenge for myself. I wanted to build a self-contained printer, meaning when you look at it, you don't know that it has a Raspberry Pi that it's utilizing. You don't know that it's running Klipper, no external wires, but I wanted to see if I could do it for under $30. Now, I've seen a few people build sleeper builds, as I'm calling them, where everything's contained in the printer using a Raspberry Pi Zero 2W. But how hard is that for someone like me who has very little knowledge of electronics and a fear of fire hazards? After a little digging, I found the magic to this system is this. This is called a buck converter, and it takes voltage in and converts it and supplies voltage out. So in our case, it's going to take the 24 volts in from the power supply of the Ender 3 Pro and output 5 volts, 5.1 volts, just to make sure we have enough current for the Raspberry Pi out. And one of the reasons I selected this particular buck converter is because it has a nice little voltage display on it. So as I'm adjusting the voltage output, I can see that displayed here and I don't have to use a multimeter. Now you can order these off of Amazon. They run about $8 for a pack of 2. So that adds $4 to our budget currently. ChatGPT also recommended that I put a 1 amp fuse between the power supply of the printer and the input of this buck converter, and that I do that on the positive line. I don't really know why, because as I said, I don't know a lot about electronics, but it acted like it could help protect the circuit. So I thought it's cheap insurance, and that cost me about $1 to do that. Because far be it from me to tell an AI chatbot that it's wrong, especially in a subject that I know nothing about. Now, quick disclaimer before you dive into these electronics and the wiring of this, I am no professional. Do not take on this project if you're not comfortable with DC voltages, if you don't know what you're doing. Making a mistake here could damage your printer or worse, hurt you. So make sure you have somebody with you that has experience with DC voltage and knows what they're doing before you take on a project like this. Now that I have the power situation sorted, it's time to locate the Raspberry Pi. Most sources would have you believe that you can get a Raspberry Pi for $15, but that's getting harder and harder to do these days. On Amazon, you can't find anything cheaper for $23 as of the making of this video. However, I was able to get this Raspberry Pi Zero 2W from Micro Center for 15 bucks. You're gonna need an SD card. And in fact, for this particular build, I found that I needed 2 SD cards. One SD card was used for the Raspberry Pi to install Pi OS on it. The second SD card was used to copy the firmware flash to it so that I could then flash the printer's main board. I couldn't see how the main board in the Ender 3 Pro would accept a USB flash on the initial flash. Everything I read said that it wouldn't, and I couldn't get it to work. So I had 2 SD cards that were required. Micro Center did sell an SD card that would work great for this project for about 7 bucks. There are some other miscellaneous things that you'll need for this build. ChatGPT recommended that I use 18 gauge wire from the printer's power supply to the input terminals of the buck converter. So that's what I did, although I don't know for a run that long if it's really necessary to use that high of a gauge. Like I said, I don't really know what I'm doing. I then used 22 gauge wire to go from the output on the 5 volt side into the Raspberry Pi. Now, wiring up the buck converter was actually easier than I had anticipated. The terminals made it very simple to just plug the wires in and crimp them down. The challenge I ran into is when I turned everything on, the buck converter said that 24 volts on the little voltmeter. So I spent forever adjusting the voltage screw trying to get that down to 5 volts. The problem, and what I didn't realize, is when the buck converter that I purchased boots up, it's showing the input voltage, and you actually have to press this little black button here to get it to switch to the output voltage, something that would have saved me a significant amount of time had I figured that out right from the get-go. But once I was able to get that all sorted, I was able to dial it into 5.1 volts. And that's just a little extra voltage so that we don't get any under voltage or undercurrent warnings on the Raspberry Pi when it boots up and we start using it. And for me, the easiest way to set up the Raspberry Pi with its power was to power it directly via pin 2 and pin 6. Based on my research, it looked like pin 2 is the 5-volt pin and pin 6 is the ground pin. So I just soldered my wires directly to that and turned everything on. And on the Raspberry Pi, nothing lit up. So I was instantly convinced that I had fried everything and I was going to need to start over, order a new Pi, and just go from there. But actually on the Raspberry Pi 02W, there are no power on lights, there are only activity lights. So you have to get the OS installed first. Little tip there that'll save you some blood, sweat, and tears. Now, in installing the OS, I opted to install the Raspberry Pi OS Lite, mainly because I didn't want to burn the Raspberry Pi Zero with a GUI or trying to load the memory for all of that when I knew that it was never going to be powering a display. And one of the really cool things about the Raspberry Pi OS utility is you can configure your Wi-Fi and all of those settings right from the get-go. So that's built into the image, so that when you plug in that SD card into your Raspberry Pi, it'll automatically connect to your Wi-Fi. And since I was only going to be remoting into the Raspberry Pi, this was perfect for me. I never had any intention of plugging in a mouse, a monitor, a keyboard, any of that, and I never had to. So that was beautiful. Now, installing Klipper is a fairly simple process, especially if you're using KIAUH. KIAUH has a GitHub page that I'll link in the description, and that GitHub page just steps you through everything you need to do to update all your dependencies, to download the repo, and to run the KIAUH script. Now, once you get to that point, though, I struggled to find what to do next. Fortunately, it's not a super complicated process. You just need to go ahead and install Klipper, install Moonraker, which Moonraker is kind of like the API that allows the web interface to communicate with Klipper, the back-end middleman, as it were. Then you need to choose your web interface, and I went with Fluid this time. I've used Mainsail on my previous Klipper installs, but I wanted to try Fluid. Mainsail is supposed to be the more mature platform, but Fluid is the up-and-coming new guy, and it's been around a while, so it's not that new. And I wanted to just kind of see how it stacks up against Mainsail, and I'll make a video about that in the future. Next, you need to build the firmware, and once you've built the firmware, you flash it. And so this is where that second SD card came in handy. I had to copy the firmware to the second SD card, and then I used that to flash the Ender 3. Finally, once you've got all that set up, you need to get the printer config and set the MCU ID in the printer config, and you're done. Plug everything in, and you should have a printer set up running Klipper. Once you have Klipper all set up, though, there's a couple of things that I recommend that you do just to get everything working properly. First, I recommend doing PID tuning, and this just kind of helps the printer know how much adjustments in power it needs to make to get the hot end hot enough and to help it maintain temperature. Next, I recommend that you calibrate your rotational distance. This is different on every printer. Then I recommend that you go ahead and level your bed. So on your Ender 3, get that situated. Once you've got that done, go ahead and calibrate your Z offset. If you're using a BL Touch or an Eddy induction probe, this is pretty easy to do. But if not, just use the baby stepping method and home your printer and then use those baby steps, set the Z offset using a piece of paper, and then go ahead and save that, and you're good to go. Okay, so now that we have Klipper all set up and running, how did I do in the challenge? Can you look at this printer and say it's a Klipper build? Probably. I would say when it comes to a sleeper Klipper build, because the USB cable comes out of the front of it, I didn't really hit that. I missed the mark there. It definitely doesn't look like a stock printer, and that kind of gives it away. There are no additional wires though. Once you turn this thing on, it boots up, it connects to the network, and you can send prints to it wirelessly, which was a major portion of my goal. So I definitely hit that. Did we do it for less than $30? Well, the Raspberry Pi cost me $15. The buck converter comes in a pack of 2 at $8. So only $4 is what I'm charging for this particular build. So that gets us up to $19. And I went ahead and bought an SD card at $7. So that puts us at 26 bucks. Then there was about $3 worth of printing material. So that puts us at $29. And I needed a fuse, and that was about $1. I hit $30 exactly. With my challenge being build this under $30, I don't think I made it. I'm gonna hold myself to it. I didn't hit the challenge goal. If I hadn't had to buy the SD card though, I would have been well under budget, which I don't think I necessarily had to buy the SD card. I did it because it was cheap. I had other SD cards laying around. I just didn't want to use a 256 gig SD card in this build. So leave a comment below. Do you think I was successful in hitting the challenge? I've been using this printer for about 15 hours now. It's working great. I'm super excited to dig more into Fluid. And if that's something interesting to you, don't forget to subscribe so you can get my thoughts on Fluid. And until next time,